We are entering the top 10, with number 10 being Juan Francisco Estrada versus Ramon Chocolatito Gonzalez 1, which took place on November 17th, 2012 for the WBA Junior Flyweight Championship. This is the beginning of the Four Princes era, which included these two, Carlos Cadres and Rungvisai. In this fight in particular, we have Chocolatito Ramon Gonzalez in the white and blue trunks going up against, in the fiery printed white trunks, Juan Francisco Estrada. This is probably one of the more advanced games of cat and mouse that you'll see in boxing. Estrada being more on the back foot, while Chocolatito is doing his signature pressuring, trying to catch Juan Francisco Estrada while he moves back. And this is also a battle of that one punch, not necessarily one punch power, but heavier shots versus more of a picking at you type of style that Estrada has. And even though Estrada does fight in spurts, you can tell that he's a bit hesitant to really stay around too long because he is aware that Chocolatito has the power advantage. These are two guys that understand their advantages and disadvantages and fight almost perfectly on both sides, understanding how they can get hit, what they're better at, and what their opponent is also good at. There's a lot of great technical offense and defense. This isn't just a straight up war. These guys are very technical in the way they approach this fight. Very high level boxing, but also a bunch of action over 12 rounds. There's a lot going on in this fight, and it really set the stage for the Four Princes era. Number 9 on the list is Marco Antonio Barrera versus Eric Morales 1, which took place on February 19th, 2000 for the WBC and WBO Junior Featherweight Championships. These guys put on probably the best all-Mexican fight that I've ever seen in boxing, and a lot of people would probably agree with me on that. The first of their trilogy, and honestly the best, that these two guys were new to each other's styles. Despite sharing the same country, they come from very different backgrounds. You have Marco Antonio Barrera in the gray trunks coming out there with this natural left-handed orthodox style, which benefited his lead hand game as he's landing some great lead body hooks in the early rounds. And Eric Morales soon realizes that trying to outbox this guy probably isn't the greatest thing of all time, as you see him in the white trunks just bringing the fight to Barrera in the 5th round, and it just devolves into a brawl, but not in a messy way. It's what I would call a technical brawl. A lot of people don't really like that term, but it's the only way that I could really describe what's going on here in the 5th round, where these guys are probably not exactly thinking about what they're doing, like each step for step, but they're so well conditioned and so well trained that all the things that they're doing is insane. The defense and adjustments that they're making is crazy, even though that they're going out there and landing a bunch of punches on each other. There's just a lot happening, and it's a great round to break down if you ever want to see that action that could come from a fight without people just going out there and randomly slinging haymakers at each other. This is one of the greatest fights of all time. It ends off very excitingly. It's a controversial decision, but in my opinion, this was a fight that didn't even matter who won. Both of these guys put their names on the map for casual audiences, and everybody just wanted more. These two, alongside Juan Manuel Marquez and Manny Pacquiao, who we'll be getting to momentarily, put the lower weight classes on the absolute spotlight in the early 2000s and made for some of the most legendary fights that we have ever seen. Number 8 on the list is Juan Manuel Marquez versus Manny Pacquiao 1, which took place on May 8th, 2004 for the WBA, IBF, and Ring Magazine Featherweight Championships. Wow, this is the second best out of all their fights that they had, going to prove that this is probably one of the top 3 rivalries in boxing history. The 4th fight took place at welterweight, so that would be on a list I would be doing a little bit later down the line. But back to this fight in particular, you have Manny Pacquiao coming off the absolute demolition of Marco Antonio Barrera and really putting himself on the map, going up against Juan Manuel Marquez, who had been very steadily increasing his stock over the years, trained by Nacho Beristain in that Ricardo Lopez-esque style, but putting more of his own flair to it, and becoming a steadily more of a power puncher as he continued to grow up and, I guess, grow into his grown man body in the higher weight classes as he would continue to move up throughout his career. But this fight in particular is started very strangely. Pacquiao knocks down Marquez 3 times in the first round, and in most other fights against most other opponents, that would be it. The guy would just be disheartened and not want to really fight anymore. You get knocked down 3 times by a guy, and it's just insane. But Juan Manuel Marquez kept himself calm enough to build a comeback and figure out how one-dimensional Manny Pacquiao was at this time. And while that one-dimensional aspect of him was more than enough to fight against 99% of people. Juan Manuel Marquez himself is a Hall of Famer and was in that 1% of boxers of all time that could just overcome something like this. And then the rest of this fight became an absolute battle of IQ, heart, everything you want to see in boxing. Marquez building himself back up and coming back to exploit the more one-dimensional southpaw style that Pacquiao had at the time. His lead hand, being his right hand, wasn't very developed. And Marquez figured that out and was able to battle himself back into what became a very close, controversial decision in the start of one of boxing all-time greatest rivalries. Definitely watch this if you like either of these guys. These are two of my favorite boxers of all time, and I'll definitely be talking about them more down the line. The number 7 fight on the list I found in an article going over the top 100 fights of Dan Albert, who is a boxing writer that has been writing stuff for a little while, and you guys should go definitely check him out if you like anything that I make. And he describes this fight, which is Mario Alberto DeMarco versus Myuya 1, which took place on November 30th, 1986 for the WBA Junior Flyweight Championship, as the highest output that he's ever seen in a boxing match. And initially, just reading about that and seeing a couple clips, I'm like, this looks pretty crazy, but I don't think there's no way it has the highest output. And after watching the full thing front to back, I have to agree this is the most insane and even exhausting fight of all time just to watch. It's a lot going on. This is probably the hardest fight to follow. The fact that these guys just keep on throwing punches at each other, on top of the fact that they're basically wearing the same exact trunks. It's just a lot going on, but it's actually in a good way. This is probably one of my favorite fights personally to watch. Even though it doesn't really have the drama of the fights ahead of it, it's just a pure spectacle what these guys were able to do and actually walk away somewhat intact. Mario Alberto DeMarco was the guy from Mexico who was coming in, expected to kind of get run through by Myuya, who was just known to completely overwhelm guys. But he himself took the strategy of refusing to go backwards and put Myuya on the back foot early. And if you could say that anything in this fight is on the back foot, but comparing the two, DeMarco was definitely the one leading the dance. But Myuya starts to adapt to DeMarco's pressure with more and more body shots, some of the best framing in particular I've ever seen in a title fight, and some amazing pivots to kind of make DeMarco use all his momentum and put him in bad positions. So Myuya starts to figure this stuff out and actually starts to land more flurries later on and kind of reverses the position of him being more of the volume puncher that he typically is and forcing DeMarco to rely on some unsuccessful power shots. But this fight doesn't slow down in any sense. Myuya starts to overwhelm DeMarco, but it doesn't seem to really matter because DeMarco thinks that he's immortal, apparently, and can just withstand anything. And both of these guys just went out there, put on one of the absolute greatest displays of cardio I've ever seen in a fight. Definitely a must-watch fight. The fighter with the Latin lettering is DeMarco, and the fighter with the Korean lettering on his trunks is Myuya. It's going to be a little bit hard to follow initially, but once you get used to it and just lock in the focus on the fight, this is one of the greatest displays in boxing history. Coming in at number 6 on the list, we have Manny Pacquiao versus Erik Morales 1, which took place on March 19th, 2005. This, in my opinion, is some of the greatest work of both of these men. You have Erik Morales coming in off of the Barrera trilogy, almost in his prime form, and this, in my opinion, is probably his best performance. Even if he was not in his physical prime, this is probably that sweet spot that he had where his physical abilities met his boxing mentality and instincts in the perfect area. And Pacquiao was just coming in here, just the almost not prime Pacquiao aura that he would have had later on in like the early 2010s, late 2000s, but this was when he had a lot of stock, just completely obliterating Marco Antonio Barrera and coming off the first Marquez fight when he proved that he was just a force of nature. And early on, he showcased how he had developed a little bit with some great lead hand tactics being used to complement his almost wild southpaw style. But Erik Morales took a very unique approach that Juan Manuel Marquez previously had not taken in his first fight with Pacquiao. He started to push Pacquiao backwards, using some great feints, especially with that right hand feint he would do when he would just throw his hand up like a little flicker and then just set everything up off of that. almost simple feint, but it was very effective. And Morales was able to push Pacquiao back, which is something that a lot of fighters had never really been able to do up to this point. Marquez in particular was relying more on his counterpunching ability, but Morales found a lot of success going forward. Early on, though, Pacquiao was able to counter this by going to Morales' body and even having him bent over, really struggling to breathe for a second in that first round, but Morales kept his head on straight, proved that he was a great fighter at himself, using his left hook to counter Pacquiao through the early middle rounds. The second half of this fight, as we go into it, is just one of the greatest second halves in boxing history. You have Pacquiao just being in his natural fighting form, and in my opinion, this is where he showcases that he is one of the best natural fighters of all time. Just a guy that can think on the fly and just act based off instinct almost, and pull himself into fights that he has no business being in, and he is able to start to come back even though Morales has the lead. And then there's also the famous way this fight ends when Morales goes into southpaw to trying to counter Pacquiao's southpaw style, and just to show a machismo and just showing that he had outclassed Pacquiao. And even though he gets hit a couple times and probably lost the round because it wasn't the best idea, it was just a great way to end this fight and be the start of one of boxing's other great rivalries. We are moving into the top 5 and the greatest fights of all time, with number 5 being Michael Carbajal versus Humberto Gonzalez 1, which took place on March 13th, 1993 for the WBC and IBF Junior Flyweight Championships. Humberto Gonzalez in the yellow trunks taking on the more lanky and deceptively good infighter, and Carbajal in the white trunks. He starts pressuring early, but Carbajal showcases that despite his lanky frame, he is very well equipped to fight on the inside. But Humberto Gonzalez really gets started with his signature stance switches and lands a knockdown with this switch stance southpaw straight. I know that's like a lot to explain, but when you watch it, you'll know what I'm talking about. He's always hitting people while he's switching stances, which is very interesting. It makes him very unpredictable. So he's a true switch stance fighter. And even though he kind of, in certain fights, fights better from different stances, it's always in the midst of switching his stance that he always manages to land knockdowns. He's a very surprising guy to fight. Carbajal is doing very well in this fight, skill-wise, but his chin just isn't holding up. It seems he gets knocked down again, and he continues to have good work on the inside despite eating these counters, but Gonzalez continues to overwhelm him with just his better overall chin, seemingly, and his own power. Carbajal starts landing to the outside a little bit more as we go into the middle rounds, and then lands a combo that hurts Gonzalez bad on the ropes. Then he lands this tight right hook, left hook combo that actually is able to KO Humberto Gonzalez in an amazing show of resilience and a great comeback by Carbajal in an absolutely legendary fight. Some of the fights I wasn't going to spoil the ending, but this fight is just so great that even if I tell you what happened, this is definitely something you need to go watch. These two guys are both in the Hall of Fame for a reason. Number 4 on the list is Rafael Limon versus Ronaldo Navarrete, which took place on May 29th, 1982 for the WBC Junior Lightweight Championship. Anytime you have two brawling southpaws going against each other, you're bound to have a great fight. And both of these guys, Rafael Limon in the red shorts and Ronaldo Navarrete in the black shorts, being a part of the Ferocious Five era of the 1980s, you were bound to have one of the all-time great fights. This is truly one of my favorite fights of all time, hence why it is so high up on the list. Rafael Limon starts off with an immediate barrage, but Navarrete starts landing his signature lead right hook, so we get a battle early on, what is established as the Limon's bodywork and more brawling heavy style, going up against the slightly more put together and technical fighting style that Navarrete has behind his lead right hook. But Limon is landing well with that wild brawling style. The greatest advantage that he has was just his sheer unpredictability. Nobody can really tell what's going on. And as we lean into this fight, both of these guys start taunting each other in the 5th round. You can tell they're really feeling it. And by the 7th round, the pace picks up to an insane work rate as Rafael Limon starts landing more and more of his body shots. But Navarrete is not just going to go down without a fight. He just starts landing that right hook almost at will as Rafael Limon continues to press forward almost recklessly. Rafael Limon was famous for his chin and his overall pressure that he always used to overcome his skill disadvantage, and this is no different. Rafael Limon just keeps on coming forward as Navarrete shows promise again with his lead hook in the 12th round before getting violently KO'd in the corner at the end of the round. This is an amazing comeback by Rafael Limon, who's just famous for his absolute wars. And Ronaldo Navarrete, I think, is one of the more underrated fighters of all time. He definitely had the skills to beat a lot of guys, and he did beat a lot of guys, but he seems to kind of be overshadowed by Bobby Shakone and Rafael Limon a lot of times, and even Cornelius Boza-Edwards, but he's definitely a great fighter in his own right. His personal life has some ups and downs that I'm not going to go into here, but he's definitely an all-time great fighter. Rafael Limon, as many of you are already aware of, is one of the greatest Mexican brawlers of all time. So this is just one of the all-time great fights. Definitely a much-watched fight for anybody that's into all-action wars. Number 3 on the list is probably a bit of an unexpected one for people that are really into these lower weight classes, but this is one of my favorite fights. It's Humberto Gonzalez versus Saman Sorjataran, which took place on July 15th, 1995 for the WBC and IBF Junior Flyweight Championships. Saman had been completely obliterated by Ricardo Lopez at 105, and in that fight, he didn't really look like anybody that I was too impressed with. I had watched the Ricardo Lopez fight a while ago before even discovering that this fight existed, to be honest. And in this fight early on, I wasn't really thinking much of him. I thought this was just going to be a showcase fight for Humberto Gonzalez. It was recommended by a lot of people that were recommending great fights in the lower weight classes, and I just thought this was just going to be a literal showcase for how good Humberto Gonzalez is, and he shows up very well early on, landing his signature switch stance right hand that really stuns Saman. But Saman lands a surprise knockdown with his own right hand in the second round, and we get more Gonzalez overwhelming Saman, adapting very quickly after getting knocked down. He has great pressure and body work in the rounds 5 and 6. And at that point, I'm just really thinking that this is literally just going to be Humberto Gonzalez overwhelming the less skilled man. But Saman really goes out there and puts it all on the line after facing some crazy adversity. This reminds me of the Leon Edwards versus Kamaru Usman fight, where Leon Edwards is clearly outmatched and just really getting beat up for the whole first however many rounds, first 4 rounds in that fight. But his corner really hypes him up as they're hyping Saman up, as you can see right now in the clips. But Saman goes out there in the 7th round and really just locks in. It does not care. He starts throwing bombs, landing an amazing knockdown on Gonzalez, really taking him by surprise, and then finally being able to TKO him on the ropes and getting the fight stopped in the 7th round and showcasing one of the greatest comebacks that I've ever seen and finally making himself a champion. This is a guy who probably shouldn't have actually become world champion if you're just going to go purely on skills and how well they're like made to fight. But this was his moment. He made the best out of it and defeated a Hall of Famer. This is truly one of the most inspiring fights that I've ever watched in boxing history, and that's why it's number 3 on this list. Number 2 on the list is Bobby Shakone versus Cornelia Boza-Edwards 2, which took place on May 15th, 1983. While this fight wasn't for a title directly, it took place at 1:30 and was further proof that the Ferocious 5 era of boxing is the greatest that the sport has ever seen, in my opinion. Bobby Shakone has his case to be the main character of boxing just because of how dramatic and action-packed all his fights were. You see him here in the red trunks going up against Cornelia Boza-Edwards in the white trunks that kind of change color over the fight, but I'll get into that. And this fight is an all-out, drag-out brawl from the beginning. Boza-Edwards has to be more tough and relentless against the skilled, lanky southpaw that Boza-Edwards is. And they both land early knockdowns on each other. And rather than taking a step back and gathering both of their minds together, they just decide that that's just a signifier that they're just in an all-out war. And the fight just kicks into full gear. Nothing is off the table with this one. Bobby Shakone gets 2 nasty cuts over his eyes that don't change the color of his trunks because he's already wearing red. But Boza-Edwards' trunks become a orangish red color, and it's just a a nasty spectacle in the best way possible. Just like the rest of this fight, it's Boza-Edwards starts getting these close rounds in the middle of the fight, but Bobby Shakone's relentlessness knocks Boza-Edwards down, kind of evening things out as we just get further and further dragged into a war. And the cherry on top, and what truly makes this one of the greatest fights of all time, is that 12th round knockdown that Bobby Shakone lands with his last little bit of energy and just putting everything out on the line and capping off one of the most entertaining fights of all time. Bobby Shakone, even though his fighting style was not the best for his longevity, both career-wise and in his personal life, he definitely was a true fighter, a guy that was willing to go out on his shield. Boza-Edwards the same, probably one of the more underrated boxers of all time. A lot of people kind of overlook him from the Ferocious Five, but he had some of the most drag-out brawls of all time. A guy from Uganda moved over to England to pursue his boxing dream. These are two guys that really put their entire life into boxing and really laid everything on the line for our entertainment. Two guys that are definitely going to be remembered for the wars that they brought to the sport and the pure entertainment of their entire career. Number one on the list and the greatest fight of all time, in my opinion, regardless of weight class, regardless of combat sport, regardless of any other metric that you may put on it, is Bobby Shakone versus Rafael Limon 4, which took place on December 11th, 1982 for the WBC Junior Lightweight Championship. This fight is an absolute war. An amazing storyline going into this. These guys had an excellent rivalry that just increased in the spectacle and intensity with every single fight they had. These are two all-time great warriors going at it. Bobby Shakone in the white shorts having to fight off his back foot a lot more than usual against the absolute powerhouse known as Bazooka Limon in the green shorts. These guys just land some of the most vicious punches over the course of this fight that I've ever seen. Breaking this down technically is not going to do any justice to just how awesome this fight is. Everybody in this fight is hurt multiple times. These guys are just trading shots with no regard for their safety. Rafael Limon lands a knockdown in the third round as Bobby Shakone is trying to box his way out of a seemingly impossible war. Bobby Shakone hurts Rafael Limon multiple times, but just can't seem to knock him down. Rafael Limon keeps coming on with these wide body shots, these wide hooks of his that are always dangerous. He knocks down Shakone again in the 10th round, as you're seeing. And Bobby Shakone seems like he's at the very end of what he can do. He's losing the war of attrition at this point, as no matter what he does, he seems to not be able to stop the force that Bazooka Limon was in the early 80s. And by the 10th and 9th rounds, we're just in an absolute war. That 9th round, right before the knockdown, is probably the most intense round I've ever seen in boxing history. It's just insanity. The 11th, the 12th, everything is just full throttle by this point. Neither guy is willing to lose, even though they're well past their second win. They're on their fourth, fifth win by this point. These old 15-round fights in particular were crazy. And then Bobby Shakone lands his last-ditch Hail Mary punch, or flurry of punches, in the 15th round that knocks down Bazooka Limon, who is able to somehow meet the count as the fight concludes. The crowd goes absolutely crazy. The crowd in this fight, and in my opinion, is probably the greatest boxing crowd I've ever seen. They're fully behind Bobby Shakone, but everybody seems to have an overall respect for the warrior that Rafael Limon was in this fight and through this entire string of 4 fights. These guys were basically made to fight each other, and even though this is the greatest fight of all time, they basically took a good portion of each other's lifespans out. This is an absolute marvel of a fight and definitely one to show anybody that wants to get into boxing.